good morning again. And that one's genuine. It's later in the morning. I've calmed down. I apologize for my previous hatred. I have all this fish food information in my head now, so I'll start again if you don't mind, just to get us back into fish kills. Okay, so as I said before, at Vertex, I work on lake restoration projects, and like I said before, we have to take into account all the various things that contribute to the overall lake health. So all the physical, chemical, and biological attributes of the lake, they interact in all sorts of different ways. And if you can pinpoint the underlying causal factors, you can often eliminate or reduce some of the issues that you might be having with managing this lake. So, excuse me. So as an example, I was saying that if you have an issue with your lake that involves a fish kill or odor or algal blooms or whatever it might be, the first thing that we do is we look at the water quality, we look at the oxygen levels, we look at the sediment, we look at the watershed area to get some information about the state of the lake and the various factors that might be contributing to the issue that the lake is experiencing. And then we look at the primary causal factors, so what is it that's driving these things that's leading up to these issues with the lake. And by approaching it in this way, by approaching lake management in this way, you reduce instances when you come into a situation, the lake has an issue, and you just constantly treat and treat and treat and treat and nothing happens. Or you keep getting these recurring instances of some sort of issue because the underlying cause hasn't been addressed. And I decided to talk about fish kills because that's something that we often see as a problem with lakes. And usually when a fish kill occurs, we get asked three main questions. Why did it occur? What do we do now? And how do we prevent it from occurring again? So what I'm basically going to do is go through some of the basics of fish kills, some of the underlying causes, the consequences of fish kills, some of the things that we don't think about, and then the cures or preventative measurements that we can take. And I'm preaching to the choir here, so amen. So I know a lot of this is information that you already have. This is stuff you already know. And as I go along, I'll make a disclaimer. I am not a fish biologist. So if there's anything here that you want to comment on, please feel free to do that. A lot of the information I have here is based on what happens down in Florida. Some of it is obviously more generalized because a lot of lakes experience similar things. In terms of fish species, I may ask you as we go through, or if you want, you can just shout it out. There are examples of species that might represent some of the examples that I go through. And I deliberately left those out, one, because I'm not a fisheries person, and two, because the type of fish that you deal with, it varies so much depending on where you are in the country, and we have a broad group here. Okay, so starting with the basics of a fish kill. When you define a fish kill, one of the first things you look at is the numbers. So 3 fish does not a fish kill make. Oftentimes a pond owner will come out and see 3 dead fish and be all in a huff because they think something's going wrong with their lake, but this happens. The other thing is that the fish die over a short period of time and in a defined area. So that's a fish kill. one thing that we don't often take into consideration is that in addition to the fish, you can also have shellfish, so you might have crayfish, crabs, and you can have other things like frogs or their tadpoles that die as well. And depending on what exactly is dead, is it only fish or are there other things, that can be a really good indication of the underlying cause. The other thing is that a fish kill occurs as a response to some acute change in the environment, and that can be a natural change such as a drought, or it can be a man-made change. So for example, the dumping of some sort of deleterious chemical into a water body. The other thing that affects or influences the type of fish kill that you find is the variation in tolerances to environmental change. So depending on the fish that you have in your pond or lake, depending on the species, you might find that some species are more susceptible to certain types of change than others. For example, we have a huge issue with these plecostomas in our waters down in Florida. And one of the things is that they do really well because even if oxygen levels are almost depleted, they can come up and go. And so everything else might die, but they're fine, for a while at least. The age of the fish matters. So you might find that older populations or younger populations are more susceptible to certain types of environmental perturbations. The sex also matters. Males and females don't always respond in the same way, especially depending on the life stage. And the size of the fish matters. So smaller fish might be susceptible to certain things while larger fish are not, and vice versa. And I'll go through some of that. When it comes to the causes of fish kills, there are many. And we can't go through each and every one of these, obviously. So what I'm going to do is just focus on a few and just kind of go through the process that we have been trying to use so that we can eliminate certain causes and try to hone in on what the actual underlying cause is. So I'll start with oxygen levels because most times when a fish kill occurs, that's the first thing people assume, that low oxygen, well, lake managers often assume that. A lot of pond owners, if the pond is being treated, they worry that it might be the pesticide that's being used, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But let's start with oxygen levels. So there are a number of reasons why oxygen levels might vary within a lake or a pond. And I left out supersaturation, which can also affect fish, but I'm focusing on low levels of oxygen. So stratification is one thing, and I'll talk about that in a bit. Increased temperatures, of course, if the water is warmer, it holds less oxygen. Prolonged cloud cover, this is something that we see down in Florida. People don't think about this, but if you have a lot of algal material in a water body, and you have an extended period of time where there's not a lot of sunlight, you can actually end up with that algal community using up more oxygen than they produce, and they can significantly deplete what's in the water column. High biochemical oxygen demand, so just the amount of oxygen that's being used up primarily by bacteria as they break down material. If that BOD level is high, then there's less oxygen available for everything else. And this is something that we often see following treatment. So if there's some sort of treatment of plants or algae and you have a quick die-off, then you can end up with an oxygen depletion issue. And I decided to show this as a graph. On the x-axis is time, so it's just a generalized axis with hours, days to weeks, months to years. And on the y-axis is oxygen consumption. So if you have a herbicide or algicide treatment that occurs at this point, you might see something similar to this. So initially you have a large die-off of your plant and algal material, and your bacterial population starts to break this stuff down. And over a few days to maybe a week or two, that population explodes as they really start to break this stuff down, and they use up a lot of the oxygen that's present. And so you might find a fish kill occurring an extended period after you've actually treated. And that often causes confusion because someone will say, well, I treated 2 weeks ago, so I don't think that has anything to do with me, when it does. And so it's something that we have to keep in mind when we manage our lakes. Indications of a fish kill being caused by oxygen depletion. You can look at certain things. For example, although most people aren't standing around staring at the lake to see when exactly a fish kill occurs, you just come out and they're dead fish. But oftentimes it occurs during the night and early morning hours, because that's when your oxygen levels are lowest, following respiration occurring all night. This is the level at which, I don't know if anyone can comment on this, but the level at which you find oxygen depletion being lethal to species, that varies depending on the species and depending on the other conditions within the lake. But generally, if you have levels less than 2 milligrams per liter, which is very, very low, most species will start to have issues, except for the ones that can come up and gulp, and even they have issues as well. It's sometimes coupled with a decreased pH simply because, for example, overnight if you have a lot of respiration occurring, a lot of carbon dioxide being produced as oxygen is taken up, then you have a buildup of carbonic acid, and so the pH level drops. And so oftentimes that coincides with the lower oxygen levels. In terms of fish behavior, you'll see gasping or swimming near the surface. The larger fish tend to die first, simply because they require more oxygen. And all species are susceptible, but like I said before, there's some that can deal with this sort of thing. So this is an example of, it may seem like a preliminary thing to you, but there are a lot of people who don't actually go through this process when trying to diagnose what has happened in their lake. Another huge issue that we deal with is turnovers. So turnovers can be due to a number of different factors. One of the biggest things is seasonal changes. And so you can end up with these repeated seasonal or repeated annual kills. So for example, in the summer you have stratification. In the fall you have turnover occurring, stratification again in the winter, and turnover again in the spring. Of course, this varies depending on where you are in the country, but you will end up, or you can end up with seasonal fish kills occurring every single year. The other thing is storm events. So heavy rainfall, high winds, that can be effective at turning over a smaller pond or a fairly shallow lake. And we often find that after a storm event passes through that we end up with fish kills that are hard to explain, if you don't know that this can actually do that. There are tidal issues as well, not here, but in Florida this is something we deal with, that you can actually have areas that you don't realize that they're connected to underlying coastal waters. And as that water moves in, you have changes, you can have turnovers occurring pretty quickly. You end up with a fish kill and no way to figure out why that happened because you don't know about that link. We actually had that happen last week. And the other thing is artificial circulation, where you deliberately force the water body to turn over. And we've had instances, there's a lake that I'm working on in St. Petersburg, Florida, where it's a 14-acre lake, about 50 feet deep at its deepest point, and aeration was installed in that lake because they were having an issue with hydrogen sulfide odors. And so they were thinking, okay, you put aeration in, you turn this over, you get rid of the hydrogen sulfide gas. The problem was they didn't size it properly. And so they estimated the depth at 18 feet when it was actually 50 at the deepest point. There's a very big difference between the volume that you calculate using an average depth of 18 versus 50. And therefore, all they did when they put this system in was churn up all the water that had been sitting at the bottom for years. And so they ended up, the first slide I showed with all those dead fish, that's what that was from. They ended up with literally thousands and thousands of dead fish, from small sardines to huge carp. The mullet died, everything. There were crabs and eels, and they even ended up with dead birds. So, because it was such a huge problem. And so I say that to point out that it's very important that you size your system properly, and when you're adding aeration, there's a way to actually implement the aeration. So you don't just put it in and switch it on, because then you trigger a serious turnover. And flipping a lake that quickly, you can get a serious fish kill. There are ways to do it that you can slowly turn on the system where you leave it on for 15 minutes, switch it off. So you let that rise and then fall, and you do that systematically over a period of time, and you allow the lake to slowly mix so you don't shock the system. The reason turnovers are such an issue is this. Like I said before, if you have a stratified lake, your upper water, the upper part of the water column might be mixing, so you might have oxygen in it, low nutrient levels, and your fish can survive pretty well in that layer. At the bottom layer where it's stratified, especially in deeper lakes, they're lakes that actually, even when they have a turnover event, the entire lake doesn't turn over. And so you can have this layer at the bottom that literally sits there for years. And if you think about it, there's very little or no oxygen in that bottom layer. Because of the various bacterial activity happening in the sediment and just above the sediment, you can have the release of various things like hydrogen sulfide gases, ammonia, a buildup of carbon dioxide. You can have a buildup of methane in those layers depending on how depleted the oxygen is and what type of anaerobic respiration is occurring. And so then, and you also have the buildup of phosphorus, which is being leached from the sediment into that bottom layer. And so then you come along with a turnover that just throws all of this water into the wider water column. And what happens is a number of things. So the low oxygen levels here being thrown up into the entire water column, along with the high oxygen demand, depletes the oxygen from most of the water column. You end up with some of these toxic substances like ammonia, like hydrogen sulfide, like methane, like high carbon dioxide levels, which can be toxic, getting into the entire water column. And because you get phosphorus being produced, being released to the entire water column, you can also end up with algal blooms. And then there's a whole other set of issues with that. The other thing to pay attention to is the periodicity. So in terms of seasonal issues, I found this, I borrowed this from an article online that, I don't think there's a code. Oh, there it is. That was looking at various mixing regimes. So not all lakes go through that cycle that I showed where they mix twice a year. So the dimictic lakes, they do. They'll mix during the spring and again during the fall. But there are also monomictic lakes that only mix one time for the entire year. Polymictic lakes that will mix several times during the year. And this is one that we tend to try to focus on, meromictic lakes, which even though they mix, they don't mix completely, because of either the morphology of the lake, they might have a very deep basin, or just the overall depth of the lake. So I thought this was an important thing to bring up as well.
So does mictic mean turnover? Is that what that means?
Yes,
Yeah.
mixing.
Yeah.
That's a new word for me.
You can throw it out there in the middle of a conversation just to mess with people. That's what I do. And so because of the multiple issues that are associated with a turnover, so a turnover will produce toxins in your water body, it will increase nutrient levels, it will deplete oxygen. You end up with multiple symptoms occurring, and sometimes it's difficult for people to pinpoint that it was actually a turnover event. You can have all fish species being affected by it, all different sizes. It just depends on which of the turnover factors was overriding. And I'll transition from that into algal blooms. And I like this part, one, because I'm trained as a phycologist, and although I'm a little intimidated by the taxonomist in the back, please be nice. But I'm doing this to differentiate between algal blooms and toxic algal blooms, which is something that I think is very important. So algal blooms, you can have, especially where we're from, algal blooms tend to be dominated by two basic types. You end up with the planktonic algae, usually dominated by various types of diatoms, and I love diatoms because they're wonderful. And you might see something that looks like this. You often find this maybe in the spring or following fall turnover. Nutrients are plumed up into the rest of the water column, and the diatoms go crazy. We also have filamentous species. So you have your Spirogyra, Cladophora that forms these filamentous clumps, and then things like Pithophora that form these really large filamentous mats almost. And so there are a lot of issues that are associated with having an algal bloom, and those are not necessarily the same as the issues that come from having a toxic algal bloom. So usually most of the toxic algal blooms are dominated by cyanobacteria, and they're categorized based on the toxins they produce. So I'm just laying out three basic groups. So anotoxins, for example, by a number of different species, but anabina is one. You might see something that looks like this on the water surface. Saxitoxins, Limbia is a species that we have a huge issue with down in Florida. And microcystins, which is probably one of the toxins that people are most familiar with, produced by a number of different species, but microcystis is one of the primary ones. And in addition to being regular blooms, and so all the issues that you have with a bloom, you have with these toxic algal blooms, they produce these toxins that are toxic not just to fish, but to other aquatic creatures, and actually to humans to some extent. If you ingest water that has some of these toxins, you can actually become ill or more.
Die.
So, in terms of the indications, algal blooms they tend to have a specific set of indications. So, in the daytime, you have very high oxygen levels because you have this huge biomass of photosynthesizing material. They produce all of this oxygen. The pH levels can go way up. But what happens is people forget that algae actually have to respire as well. So once the sunlight is gone at night, you have this huge biomass, and all it's doing is using up oxygen. And it will end up using up more oxygen than it produced during the daytime. And once that has happened, that means there's nothing left for the fish to consume. Toxic algal blooms will do exactly the same thing, because they're algae and it's still a large mass of of respiring material at night, so you get the same sort of symptoms. But in addition to that, because of the toxins that are produced, you end up with symptoms of poisoning. So it might be lethargy, it might be convulsive, it might be swimming. And usually what you see is that the smaller fish die first because in terms of size, for them, a particular amount of toxin it's relative, so it's a higher concentration as compared to a larger fish being exposed to the same amount. And generally what you find is that all fish species are affected by that. So if you go into an area and you see that it's all different sizes and all different species, and the oxygen levels are fine, you might want to start considering an algal bloom, especially if there's an algal bloom. And so I'll go from toxins caused by algae to other toxic agents caused by us. So the most obvious one is pesticides, so herbicides or algicides that we apply either directly to the water or that we apply to areas adjacent to the water, and after a rain event that stuff washes in to the lake. There are also other things that we have very little or no control over. Heavy metals, detergents, various things that can wash off the roadway or off adjacent lands into a lake. We've had instances where we've had parking lots that have been paved, and a day or two later there's a rain event, that stuff washes in and you end up with a fish kill. And if you don't know that there's a link between the various chemicals in that asphalt, the linkage between the runoff from that parking lot into the lake, you'll miss it. And you'll start looking for all sorts of other things. And of course, they're natural toxins. So we talked already about the various things that can build up in the lower water column and then be reintroduced into the whole system following a turnover event. And so, I'll go back. So some of these things we can't control, but I thought I'd take a minute just to focus on the part that we can control, which is when, as lake managers, if you are involved in applications, so if you do apply herbicides or algicides, it's important to pay attention to fish kills that occur that might be related to what you have done. No one in this room, just, a hypothetical person. So again, this is the same graph with hours, days to weeks, months to years on the x-axis. And on the y-axis, this is a fish response level. So basically, fish kill response. So if you apply a herbicide or an algicide at this point, and you get what I'll consider an acute fish kill, so within hours or within a day or two, you have a number of dead fish, then it's probably because of what you did. And you have to consider what aspect of what you did caused the fish kill. So you can have direct effects, so obviously toxicity. If you use the wrong dosage, you may have applied something that actually poisoned the fish. But there are other things as well. So there are physical symptoms. Some of the chemicals that are used cause gumming up of mouth parts. They might actually burn the fish, gill occlusion, and all these things can cause fish kills as well. There are also changes to the water quality. Some chemicals, you have to be very careful with them. Shh. Because they can cause... Oh no, that's...
It's bothering me too.
Oh, okay. All right. I just get distracted because I start listening to what they say on my phone. You can have chemicals that actually cause pH changes, for example. A 1 or 2 point pH change in a water body can actually significantly affect the fish within the water body, and you can end up with a fish kill. The delayed response we spoke about already, so that's usually, it can be a toxic effect that requires a certain amount of time for the toxins to build up in the system of the fish, but it usually is due to bacterial growth, breaking down that vegetation that's just been killed, an increase in BOD, oxygen depletion, and then a fish kill. And so this alone is important as an indicator of whether or not someone was responsible for a fish kill. And oftentimes that's a really important thing for us to be able to identify, whether or not we were responsible, and then you go ahead and do whatever corrective action is necessary. I had the option, actually I had another version of this where I had a chronic response, so something that would occur, you know, within months to years. But I couldn't think of, I thought about bioaccumulation of toxins over a period of time, but what popped into my head was mercury, or some other toxin that stays in the system for a very long time. I took it out though because I couldn't think of materials that we use now that would do that. I don't know if anyone knows.
Copper.
Copper. I don't know that, I wasn't sure how long copper would take, because there's some species that they actually show symptoms fairly quickly, and there are others that it bioaccumulates in the snails and then moves up through the system. So I gave this talk at a meeting with a lot of applicators, and I was worried about putting anything about copper in case I get stoned. So those are some of the main causes, but there are a number of others that we can't go through because of time, of course. So things like water level changes. A simple thing like a drought or a flooding event, as you change the water level, you change a number of other things. You change the concentration of solutes, you change oxygen concentrations, the temperature becomes more of an issue. If you have less water, it heats up more quickly, that's an issue. You decrease the habitat where the fish can actually go. And so you get a fish kill occurring in response to that, that's evident. Turbidity is an important one. We often don't think about how much of an issue it is for a gill breather. If they have particles stuck in their gills, they will suffocate and die. And so if you have a rain event or construction or something occurring in an area that results in this, and then you end up with a fish kill, that's something that often happens. Something else we don't think about is spawning. There are a number of species that go through a spawning period, and at the end of that, two things might happen. There are some species that actually naturally die after a spawning event, and there are others that after a spawning event they're tired and they're much more likely to be susceptible to environmental change. So you have them being all active for a period of time, and then you come in with some sort of oxygen change or pH change, and they just can't deal with that. Ryan mentioned also just the health of the fish. So if you have fish that are not, oh, Ryan's out there. If you have fish that aren't healthy, if they don't have a good diet or whatever, and then they're exposed to a stressful event, they're much less likely to be able to survive that. And then there are diseases and parasites. That is usually self-evident. You can just look at the fish and see lesions or bloodshot eyes or what have you, although some of them are internal issues that you might not see, but you can usually send it to some lab and they can identify it for you. So that's just a basic run through of some of the issues that cause fish kills and how you can kind of go through that bottom-up process to figure out what the exact cause is. Now, once you have a fish kill, the consequences are sometimes more than you actually think. So obviously they're dead fish, and that's a big deal in an ecosystem where fish is a primary component. It's also a big deal in an ecosystem where you're deliberately growing fish. So that's the major thing, but there are other issues that come up. So of course, dead fish, you get the breakdown, you get odor, you get flies, You can get dead birds from birds. Actually, this is from that same lake that had that huge fish kill in St. Petersburg. We had tons of birds coming in, and we had pelicans and hingers and gulls coming in, and they were overfeeding because there was so much fish, and some of them actually choked.
I
And
hope it was the end.
I know. It's funny, but not really funny. Anyway, and then one thing we don't think about often enough is the nutrients that get returned to the system. Now, this is just a basic diagram showing the phosphorus cycle. And I'll just bring you to this point. They're the fish. As they die and they're broken down by bacteria, any phosphorus that's held within their biological material gets released to the water column. And if you have thousands of fish that just died and they're not removed, they die, they sink and fall to the bottom, and all this phosphorus is released, this is what you get. And so it's really important after a fish kill occurs to manage it in a way that you don't exacerbate the problem, because you end up with the algal bloom that depletes oxygen and you just get this cycle. There are other consequences. You have to deal with the public. So there's dissatisfaction, there are complaints, distrust, suspicion, and you reinforce this negative association that it doesn't matter what the actual cause of the fish kill was. People will think that pesticides plus fish equals this. And so it's very important that if this happens, it means that you've done something wrong. Because the various regulations that are in place, the information on the labels, they're there to prevent this from happening. So as long as there's proper use, this shouldn't happen. And as lake managers, we should be able to explain that to the public and present to them other causes for the fish kill. Or if it is something that we did, we should also be able to say that. In terms of prevention, there are only a few ways, I think, to truly prevent a fish kill. And you can only prevent certain types of fish kills. So maintaining a healthy lake state, if you can maintain healthy circulation, you can eliminate the whole issue of turnover in the first place, because the system is continuously being turned over. Maintaining a healthy lake state, if there are ways that you can limit the amount of nutrients running into the system, the amount of organic matter building up in the system, that sort of thing. The correct application. So if herbicides or algicides do have to be applied, pay attention to the dose that's being used, the time of year that you treat. You might not want to treat following a turnover period. You might not want to treat after a drought. The time of day, you may not want to treat first thing in the morning when oxygen levels are low, pH levels are low. The habitat that you're treating. So in this, I'm showing a guy who's just spraying around the periphery, which is what we often do. And you might end up with a specific type of fish kill. There's smaller fish that hide out in these areas. They're not going to go out into the wider water. And so you'll end up with a number of small dead fish. Customers might see that and ask questions, and you should be able to explain, well, this is why. Pay attention to the size of the lake. If you're treating a larger lake, there are more areas for fish to retreat to. If it's a smaller lake and you treat that, there's nowhere for them to go. And so you're much more likely to end up with a fish kill. And so you need to consider maybe partial lake treatments. There are things that are out of our hands. So droughts, storms, disease, there's nothing you can do about that to prevent it. But you can be proactive in terms of considering the state of the lake or the state of the system before you do anything like treating. And also be prepared to diagnose and respond, which is the only thing you can do at that point. Figure out what the cause is and respond to it. In terms of diagnosis, you look at behavioral symptoms, you look at the size and the species of the fish, you can look at visible symptoms that might indicate disease. You can pay attention to whether or not it's only fish. So if you have things like air breathers, like turtles, that are dying as well. That's an immediate indication that it's not an oxygen issue. It most likely is some sort of toxin. And that allows you to eliminate that and move on. And then water quality testing, which allows you to identify underlying causes. So look at oxygen levels, look at pH levels, look at hydrogen sulfide levels, although you might not need to because you'll just smell it. And then there are other things. Very important to get those dead fish out. Some people think that in a natural system, this is part of the natural cycle, so you leave the dead fish, they feed back nutrients to the system. And in a perfect world, yes, there are lakes where that happens, and it is a natural part of the cycle, and it is fine. A lot of the lakes that we deal with, they're already stressed by large amounts of nutrients coming into the system. And so what you want to do is get that stuff out of the system, and so it doesn't overload it. You may have to restock the system if a lot of fish have died, and in doing that you have to pay attention to the type of fish you're going to put in, and you also have to make sure that you improve the lake state before you put those in. So oftentimes managers, in trying to please their customers, they just say, okay, there was a fish kill, let's clean it up and restock, without paying attention to why there was a fish kill in the first place and dealing with that issue before you expose even more fish to a cruel death. So all of that brings me back to my initial slide, where we're trying to do this bottom-up approach to management. And at Vertex, what we're basically doing is we have a restoration unit that offers consultation services. We go out and we do lake assessments. We start, depending on the type of lake, we often start with mapping the lake. It's really important for you to understand the depth of the lake, to understand where the vegetation is in the lake. For example, that lake in St. Petersburg, once they had that issue, we went in and did a mapping, and we could actually tell what the actual depth was, and we could add aeration that compensated for that particular volume. We also have water quality assessment services that we provide, so we can go in, look at oxygen levels, pH profiles, conductivity. We can take water samples and actually analyze them to see what kind of water quality do you have, and what of that might be causing your overall problem. And the other thing we do is we provide information to the public. We have brochures that give the public information about what might be causing their various issues. So, and I have some of those brochures that I can provide for you after if you're interested. So thank you for your time. Sorry, I went to the
Hey, that's great. All right, we can take a question or two real quick. Anybody got one?
Hi, Bob. Sure. A lot of the folks that are in this room deal with sport fish ponds. A lot of the examples you used were from Florida, natural lakes and tidal systems. So that's one of the things you didn't talk about. You mentioned it in the beginning, was water chemistry. And from my experience dealing with people with fish kills, it's probably the second leading cause of fish kills in ponds, particularly low alkalinity pH problems. Usually we see it in late winter, spring, when the water temperatures are going up and down, the fish get really stressed out. If alkalinity is low in the pond, the fish can't osmoregulate right, and they get sick with other things, and we see a few fish of all species dead every day. And I noticed, I wanted to mention that because a lot of folks here may have to deal with that. It's a real simple fix for that. That's why we lime ponds. We lime ponds to make them more productive. We lime them to make the fish healthier. But I noticed on your Vertex list of services, alkalinity was not included in your basic package, and that's probably the first thing that I, as a fisheries extension guy, measure.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just curious why you guys don't.
Oh, we do.
Okay, so I saw
We do.
on the basic package it wasn't listed as one of the components. On the full package it was.
Oh, yeah, the basic package that I have there, I actually put up, I think, 3 or 4 packages. We have 10 billion different packages because what I do is I customize it based on the issues that the lake is having. So, for example, we have lakes that might have an issue with really high phosphorus levels. That I assume that's what the issue is because they have a lot of algae, let's say. And so for them, we might recommend something that we have that's the phosphorus package. And so we test phosphorus levels, we do alkalinity, pH, various things, because we might be moving them towards an alum treatment, for example. And so in that case, you have to know the alkalinity and everything else. The basic package there is really for people who, they have a lake that doesn't necessarily have a huge issue, but sometimes people just want information about the background levels in their water. So
I would encourage you to add alkalinity to the
I
basic
will do
package,
that.
because it tells you so much about, what needs to be done in the pond. And one of the things, the questions I get a lot is, I would like someone to test the pH of my pond. I respond, well, I'll test the pH of your soil, but the pH of your water doesn't tell me a thing. Because if your alkalinity is low, your pH is doing this, and depending on whether I test in the morning or the afternoon or the night.
Exactly.
So the other thing I wanted to mention was, you mentioned with diseases, you said there's not a whole lot you can do about that. I disagree. If people get their fish from a reputable source that tests their fish, and they don't bring fish in from elsewhere, and they watch boats coming in that are dumping live well water, they can do a lot to prevent big disease problems in their ponds.
Thank you. That is a very good point. I have the tendency to focus on natural systems that do whatever they do, but in terms of fisheries, you are correct, yes.